Canadians are feeling the weight of high interest rates, low productivity, and persistent inflation. Canada's GDP per capita has been trending down for several quarters, and without our natural resources, Canada's trade deficit would be structural and significant. Our population is also aging fast. Going forward, private sector economists' forecasts point to no growth in 2024 and subdued growth thereafter. Whether there's a technical recession will be of little comfort to Canadians, as interest rates are expected to remain high for the foreseeable future. For the federal government, debt servicing costs will continue to be much more prohibitive than previously forecasted in Budget 2023. Growth rates that are lower than interest rates will have a dramatic impact on fiscal policy. Governments can no longer run permanent large deficits without fear. This fiscal year, the federal government will use almost as much of its revenues to service the debt than providing healthcare transfers to provinces and territories. This is why we continue to urge the government to adopt a new and credible fiscal anchor, one which would limit debt servicing costs to a maximum of 10% of revenue going forward. By doing this, we think it will preserve the government capacity to fund programs Canadians rely on and not put an excessive and unfair fiscal burden on future generations.
We've never had Governor Macklem come out and say how inflationary the fiscal policy of the government could be until yesterday, where during the Monetary Policy Report press conference he said, and I'm quoting, "We expect government spending to grow at 2.5%. What that means is that if all those spending plans are realized, government spending will be adding to demand more than to supply, and in an environment where we are trying to moderate spending and get inflation down, that's not helpful." Very strong words from the bank governor. And basically what he's saying is that this spending is causing inflation and is making his job harder. Would you agree with that sentiment?
I would agree that, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I would agree that for the last few years, fiscal policy has not been aligned with monetary policy, and that one has been working against each other. It is harder for the bank to do its job to bring back inflation at 2%. The government keeps spending over 2%, which is the price stability target for the bank over time, and that's just simple math. And by the way, this includes provincial governments as well, because they do spend quite a bit of money. So I think it's really important that at the end of the day, fiscal policy is aligned with monetary policy. And why is that? Because we do want the cost of living to come down for Canadians, and we do want Canadians to have the purchasing power that enable them to live through things that they can afford. If we don't do that, we're just making lives of Canadians harder. I think it's just simple math. And so without going into the specific, I would say that I very much agree with Governor Macklem comments yesterday. What's the finality here? The finality is to work for the benefit of Canadians. And the benefit of Canadians on fiscal policy is that we bring back inflation back to 2% as fast as we can. Because the more time it takes, the more painful it is on the cost of living. It's as simple as that. And so it's not a question of having a small government or a big government. The question right now is just cyclical. We need to bring back spending to a level that won't make Canadians' life harder.
What is the concern if the debt-to-GDP ratio continues to rise over the rest of the decade?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The basic math is that the more you spend on debt servicing, the less you have to spend on anything else, as I said in my remarks. And that includes healthcare, education, all the things I think Canadians cherish and want more of, including international aid, including more defense on spending. And so the more, as we did in the 90s, the more we spent on interest rates rising and servicing our debt, the less we spend on these core missions of the state, the core priority. So the fiscal anchor, I think it's important to say, Mr. Chair, is not an end in itself. What the fiscal anchor is trying to protect is the ability for the government to preserve its capacity to give services and programs to Canadians without hiking taxes, without cutting programs that have been so difficult to go through in the 90s when we had to do it.
There are a lot of demands for government to increase spending in certain areas. There are existing programs that people depend on. So what are the things that you would have recommended that we not spend money on, or that we should not spend money on going forward, that we are spending money on, to get to the fiscal position that you're suggesting? Like, what should we cut, I guess is what I'm asking.
So this is for the government to decide, what the elected government to decide where it wants to put its focus on in terms of spending priorities. What I'm saying is, going forward, the fiscal framework that has a structural deficit in the context of high interest rates and rising going forward will put these very important priorities, and I agree with you, they are all important and jeopardy. So this is what I'm trying to say we want to preserve. We want to preserve healthcare. We want to preserve post-secondary education. We want to preserve international aid. And by spending more, unfortunately, you will put these things in jeopardy, in my opinion. So I'm not here to say to the government, here's where you need to cut. What I'm saying is the trajectory of spending right now is not sustainable. I think it's fair to say we do have a growth problem in this country, a business investment problem, which is obviously linked to productivity. And the way to do this, the way to remediate to this problem is to have pro-growth policies, pro-growth framework that allows us to grow our economy so that we can do all the good things I think that people around this table want to do for our economy, for Canadians. But in the absence of growth, in the absence of productivity enhancement in this country, unfortunately, what we'll do is just do deficit financing on every new measures. And that leads to more debt servicing, and it leads to governments at one point making hard decisions on program cuts or raising taxes, which would decrease business investments. So, you know, and the other thing I would say is we live in a very competitive world. The U.S. has moved aggressively on the IRA. It has led to huge business investments. In here, I would say we're still very tentative. All these tax credits that the government put forward for the green transition are yet to be implemented. I cannot stress enough how important it is that we compete with a level playing field that allows business investments to grow.
Can you speak to climate impacts on businesses over the last year?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the question is very relevant. Every company's big, small, we represent larger firms, obviously, but is dealing with this thing. It's not going to go away. It's just going to accelerate. The Business Council has been supportive of carbon pricing for the last 20 years. So this is something we've been supportive of. And so I think for the government, it's a question of being proactive on climate policy, but also on climate adaptation. And I think this summer has shown that the adaptation part maybe was underlooked maybe by policymakers, given the size of what's happening in the world on the climate change. I think it's fair to realize it's clear we are realizing that the adaptation side will need to take a more important kind of focus for policymakers.
Do you believe that carbon pricing is an effective way to, I mean, there's many things we have to do, but that it is effective in helping to address climate crisis?
Yes. In general, carbon pricing, I think, is something we've been supportive of. What I think is worrisome when I look at government intention, for example, on oil and gas cap production, that I think would be an overkill in actually would deconstruct the carbon pricing mechanism that is agnostic of sectors. So I would warn the government to really be careful about this measure.